Several million years ago, in our known universe, one of the most mysterious and puzzling sequences of events began to unfold. A chain of enigmas whose remarkable peak has been nothing other than the very subject you see in this photograph, published in 2012, the human brain. But this is not merely any human brain, rather the most profoundly human brain in all of recorded history. When people casually speak the phrase, human brain, the vast majority likely have no concrete idea what they are actually talking about beyond the most superficial level. Consider this thought experiment. If you had approached someone 500 years ago and asked them what was that bright thing hanging in the sky above them, they would likely have turned their finger at their temple dismissively and walked away, considering you foolish. But if you did not relent, if you persisted with your questioning and followed them, they might finally surrender to your persistence and say that it was the sun, and that it was indeed the source of life on Earth. But what the sun truly was, in its essential nature, the nuclear furnace in the sky, that particular person from 500 years ago would have possessed absolutely not the slightest understanding whatsoever. They might have understood it as a light source, a giver of warmth and day, but the nuclear fusion reactions occurring within it would have been completely beyond their comprehension. Perhaps this historical analogy is not entirely perfect, because the thing that now sits behind your eyes, this very thing you are right now using to comprehend these words, contains vastly more mysteries than some ordinary star. Mysteries that are profound and complex in ways we are only beginning to understand. The human brain is the only thing in the entire universe that attempts to understand itself. Think about that extraordinary fact for a moment. As physicist Michio Kaku has eloquently said, science, by stripping away the veils from consciousness and mystery, makes consciousness appear more ordinary and mundane. Yet paradoxically, the more I learn about the actual complexity and intricacy of the brain, the more profoundly astonished I become that we have on our shoulders the most complex known object in the entire universe. It is a truly humbling realization for anyone who thinks about it. Few would venture to dispute that among all human brains in existence throughout history, the one most remarkable and worthy of scientific study is probably the brain shown in this particular photograph, because the brain documented here belonged to Albert Einstein himself. If we truly believe, as many do, that intelligence and the capacity for abstract thought are what fundamentally make us human, then Einstein's brain represents one of the most human brains in the entire history of our species. I challenge you to tell me, name me even one other person whose surname can be found in the dictionary as a synonymous entry for the very word genius itself. The answer is virtually none. Everyone, from scientists to students to the general public, wanted to know what was so extraordinarily special about his brain. What hidden structures, what unique neural architecture could possibly produce such revolutionary and transformative insights that changed human civilization. However, Einstein himself, despite all the scientific interest in his brain, adamantly refused to bequeath his organs to science. Remarkably, he specifically wished his body to be cremated and his remains scattered. But when he died in Princeton Hospital on April 18, 1955, at the age of 76, the attending pathologist, Thomas Harvey, who was performing the autopsy, made a fateful and controversial decision. He simply took the scientist's brain without permission, essentially stealing this most precious specimen of human neurology. He then meticulously photographed it from numerous different angles and perspectives, documenting it thoroughly. Subsequently, he sliced it into precisely 240 separate pieces, which he systematically distributed to researchers throughout the United States and Canada, keeping detailed records of what went where. This controversial acquisition became the most studied brain in the history of neuroscience. Only more than half a century later, in 2012, in the prestigious peer-reviewed journal Brain, did the general public finally get to see the actual photographic images of the great Einstein's brain. Of course, I fully understand that, unless you are a trained specialist in neuroanatomy or neuroscience, you probably cannot identify any particular distinctive details in the structure of his brain from a single photograph. The image would look largely similar to any human brain to the untrained eye. However, if Einstein's brain warrants its own dedicated article on Wikipedia in 22 different languages, spanning multiple cultures and regions of the world, then clearly there must be something extraordinary about it. There must be something that the international research community found significant enough to discuss and debate across so many different cultures and language groups. Let us now examine in detail what researchers actually discovered when they studied Einstein's preserved brain using modern scientific techniques. First and foremost, Einstein's brain weighed surprisingly only 1,230 grams. This measurement is quite precise, as Thomas Harvey carefully documented every detail of his controversial acquisition. Now, this might not sound particularly unusual until you realize that this weight is approximately 12% less than the average weight of the brain of an ordinary healthy man in his same age group and demographic. The average male brain at his age weighed roughly 1,400 grams, so Einstein's brain was noticeably smaller. Now, those who might casually say this is not such a big difference, well, let me tell you clearly and definitively, we are not discussing the weighing of candies or confections here. We are talking about one of the most complex objects in the known universe, and 12% is actually quite significant. That is not a rounding error, that is a meaningful difference. Think about it logically. What would need to happen for you to voluntarily agree to have a brain that is 12% smaller than average? What extraordinary compensation would you demand? What special abilities would you need to possess to accept such a trade? What would need to be true about your life for you to make that bargain? In short, what research has discovered is that a brilliant and creative brain does not necessarily need to be large in overall size or mass. This is a maximally counterintuitive discovery, is it not? It completely contradicts our initial intuitions about intelligence and brain size. We tend to assume that bigger equals better, that a larger brain must logically contain more neural power and more processing capability. But the evidence from Einstein's case suggests otherwise. The relationship between brain size and intelligence is weak at best. Among humans, there is a small positive correlation, but it is far weaker than people expect. Some people with very large brains are not particularly intelligent. Some with smaller brains are exceptionally brilliant. Second, although Einstein died at the advanced age of 76 years old, it was specifically noted by researchers and pathologists who examined his brain tissue under microscopy that the condition and state of his brain tissue corresponded not to that of a 76-year-old man experiencing normal age-related decline, but rather to that of a much younger person. The neural tissue showed considerably less age-related deterioration and degradation than would be expected for someone of his advanced age. In light of this fascinating discovery about his youthful brain, Einstein's own words and personal reflections take on entirely new and deeper meaning. Einstein himself once reflected publicly, "Sometimes I ask myself, how is it that I was the one who developed the theory of relativity?" He then continued with his own interpretation and insight. "The reason, I think, is that a normal adult human never really thinks deeply about the problems of space and time. I thought about such things quite seriously as a child, but my intellectual development proceeded with a significant delay compared to my peer group. As a result, I only became genuinely interested in space and time after I had already grown up and matured as a person." Apparently, one should understand him quite literally here. His childhood delay in intellectual development meant his mature mind approached these fundamental questions with the freshness, wonder, and curiosity of youth even as an adult. Third, researchers discovered that his brain lacked one of the major and prominent fissures that appear in most human brains, the so-called lateral sulcus. This is a significant anatomical feature that distinguishes his brain from the typical human brain structure. Fourth, and this is the absolutely crucial point, we should stop the list of brain peculiarities and anatomical differences right here. The fact is that all of the above-mentioned findings, or any other research that has been conducted on Einstein's brain over the past century, has contributed absolutely nothing concrete to our actual scientific understanding of human intelligence. If you gave the world's most leading neuroscientists and brain researchers 10 different brains to study in detail, and did not tell them that one of those brains belonged to the great Einstein himself, these world-class researchers would not be able to suspect anything unusual or extraordinary about any of them. They would not be able to point to a specific brain and say with certainty, that one belongs to a genius. Because no one, to this very day, despite all our advanced neuroimaging technology, knows exactly what specific structural features or neural characteristics a genius brain has that an ordinary brain lacks. Such is the current state of affairs in modern neuroscience. Although the small gelatinous mass of matter captured in this photograph forever changed the entire course of world history and human civilization in profound ways, nonetheless, no one has the slightest concrete idea why this particular brain produced such revolutionary and transformative ideas. Many scientists and lay people simply expected to find in Einstein's brain some dramatically and obviously enlarged region, some noticeable bulging area, and then they could triumphantly announce that the center of human intelligence had finally been discovered and located. Based on the fact that some of our distinct abilities, such as vision, hearing, touch sensation, and movement, are quite clearly and directly linked to the work of specific and localized brain regions, one might very reasonably expect that there should be another dedicated zone or region for intelligence as well. After all, if we can point to the visual cortex for seeing and the motor cortex for movement, why not point to an intelligence cortex for thinking and reasoning? But in our human brain, there is no such single, unified center of intelligence. There is no intelligence gland or intelligence region that houses all our cognitive abilities. Apparently, we should not expect such crude, simplified logic to apply to such a mysterious and complex phenomenon as human intelligence. In everyday life, we seem to know exactly what our intelligence is. After all, we use it constantly. We experience it directly. We feel it when we solve problems or learn new things. Yet in reality, after thousands of years of philosophical reflection and modern scientific research, humanity has never managed to develop a universally accepted definition of what makes us human and distinguishes us from other creatures. This is a constantly elusive and receding mystery. How are thoughts born in the brain? Where do insights and creative inspirations come from? And ultimately, what on earth are we, fundamentally? In the early 20th century, an English psychologist named Charles Spearman noticed something remarkable that had not been systematically documented before. He noticed that for some reason, school children's grades in various seemingly unrelated subjects were positively correlated with each other. What does this observation mean? We have become so accustomed to the existence of straight-A students in school that we do not even ask ourselves the fundamental question: why do they even exist? What connection could there possibly be, for example, between mathematics and Russian language? These are completely different subjects, requiring different types of skills and knowledge. Nobody seems surprised that if a person gets straight 5s in mathematics, they are likely to get straight 5s in Russian as well. And conversely, if Russian is not working out for you, if you struggle with language arts, you likely have trouble with mathematics too. Of course, we all know examples that seem to contradict this pattern. We all know examples of talented students with poor grades and not very talented students who nonetheless do well in school. However, such examples are exceptions rather than the rule. Based on this observation of correlation patterns, Spearman hypothesized something profound, that each person possesses some elusive hidden variable, some abstractly speaking, general intellectual core, the power and capacity of which determines how well a person can handle the most diverse tasks, solving equations, understanding complex texts, memorizing information, learning new skills, and so forth. This presumed intellectual core he called general intelligence, or the G factor, from the English word general. It was a bold theoretical proposition. Over the subsequent 100 years since Spearman's initial observation, scientists became quite firmly convinced that the G factor really does exist as a measurable phenomenon. Various mental abilities are not independent of each other, they are interconnected. For example, the better you can rotate three-dimensional objects in your imagination, the faster you can calculate the probabilities of winning in various poker hand combinations. This seems strange. Why would spatial visualization ability predict probability calculation? Do not look for an obvious logical connection in these examples. It just works out that way somehow. Yes, even your vocabulary is somehow connected, for instance, with your ability to identify patterns between events, or, I do not know, with how many numbers you can simultaneously hold in your short-term working memory. All these seemingly unrelated abilities point to some common underlying factor. So if you did not grasp this important point, Let me state it more clearly and directly. We do not know what the G factor, or general intelligence, actually is. It is an elusive thing that mysteriously manifests itself in the most diverse aspects of your life. We cannot touch it or weigh it on a scale, because when speaking of something tangible and physical, such as the size of your body, we know what we are measuring. We know what 0 centimeters is and what 100 centimeters is. We have concrete reference points. But how do you measure intelligence when we do not even know what it fundamentally is? How do you put a number on something so abstract and poorly understood? The solution to this measurement problem emerged gradually through statistical research over decades of work by psychometricians and behavioral geneticists. If we take, for example, 1,000 people of the same age and have them take various tests that we traditionally associate with intelligence, tests of logic, abstract thinking, memory, information processing speed, pattern recognition, spatial reasoning, and so on, then the test results of these 1,000 people will be distributed in a very particular pattern. They will form what mathematicians call a bell curve or normal distribution. This pattern appears to be universal and consistent across different populations and cultures. There will be fewer people at the edges or extremes, those who showed the lowest and highest results, while the absolute majority of people with average results will obviously be in the middle. This pattern is remarkably consistent across different groups. It is almost as if intelligence is naturally distributed this way across human populations. The shape of the curve, the position of the average, and the spread around it remain strikingly similar whether you test wealthy children or poor children, men or women, people from different countries. This is practically the only way we can quantitatively express the G factor of each person in a meaningful way. That is, we do not actually know what the G factor is in absolute terms. We cannot point to it or touch it or see it directly, but we can compare your G with the G of other people relative to the population distribution. The more qualitative and diverse intellectual tests the subjects take, the more accurately we can assess each person's G in comparison to others. Someone's position on the curve becomes increasingly clear with more data points. The correlation between their performance on different types of tests remains consistent, supporting the idea that something general underlies performance. Researchers, in order not to conduct a million different tests all the time, and to standardize the process across different populations and time periods, develop specific tests. And by taking just one of these properly constructed tests, you can very accurately measure your G relative to others. These are intelligence quotient tests, commonly known by the abbreviation IQ, and they measure the G factor so well and accurately that IQ is often used as a synonym for G, as a synonym for general intelligence. Now you will understand very clearly what IQ measurement actually is, and what it means, because most people do not understand this correctly, and honestly, I did not either before studying this material. But in reality, IQ testing is a rather cruel and harsh thing. It reveals uncomfortable truths about human variation. Look at our bell-shaped curve pattern. In our standard distribution, the average value is assigned a score of 100 points, and most people, specifically 68%, score between 85 and 115 points on the IQ scale. And now, here is the absolutely crucial part that most people misunderstand. If your IQ is 130 points, this does not mean that your general intelligence is 30% higher than that of a person with an IQ of 100. That is a common misunderstanding. No, if your IQ is 130, this means that your general intelligence is presumably higher than that of approximately 98% of all people in the general population. Not 30% higher in absolute terms, but higher than 98 out of 100 people. That is, if your IQ is 130 and you live in a country like Russia. Considering that the country has a population of 144 million people, this means that your intelligence is presumably higher than that of 141 million people. You can actually calculate that statistically. You spake ask, but why engage in such a cruel and seemingly harsh measurement? Well, consider this perspective. If in childhood you even roughly assess your G, your general intelligence, for instance using the same IQ test, you will get a reliable prediction of an astonishing number of things in your life. These things that intelligence predicts range from your grades in school and university, the success of your career, the probability of substance dependency, and end with how long and healthy a life you will live, whether you will engage in criminal activity, and whether you will go to prison. Not bad for a single 30-minute test, right? That is why these intelligence tests, despite seeming crude, are considered one of the greatest achievements in the history of psychology. And the G-factor itself is one of the most influential and respected concepts in modern psychology and neuroscience at the present time. Although the idea of the G-factor was originally proposed by Charles Spearman in the early 20th century, the key contribution to its popularization and the most complete and convincing basis for this concept was made by an American psychology professor named Arthur Jensen. In 1969, Jensen published one of the most infamous and controversial works in the history of psychology and social science. To say that he received criticism for this work would be a monstrous understatement of monumental proportions. He could not speak about it at the American Psychological Association without the threat of an emotional outburst and riot among the audience. Some college students even burned an effigy of Jensen and sent him letters threatening to kill him. The reaction was extreme, and more than half a century after his paper was published, I would still not recommend you reproduce publicly what you will hear next in this discussion. So it might seem logical that children from poor families study worse than others because, for example, their parents do not have time to work with them on their education. These children are worse nourished and undernourished. They do not have access to quality medical services. They live in worse neighborhoods with worse schools, and so forth. That is why politicians in various countries have been directing billions of dollars for decades towards so-called compensatory programs. These programs are specifically designed to reduce inequality between the poor and the rich. In particular, the goal was that children from poor families could study on equal terms with children from wealthy families. The intention was noble. So Jensen's infamous work begins with the phrase, I quote directly, "Compensatory education has been tried and apparently has failed." The main goal of compensatory education, to eliminate the educational lag of children from disadvantaged families and thereby reduce the achievement gap between students from different social groups, was not at all achieved by any of the major programs that were evaluated. Arthur Jensen. The article was titled, "How much can we increase IQ and school achievement?" Since it is known that IQ predicts school success better than any other measurable attribute of a child, it is considered fair or not that if one could significantly raise a child's IQ, then his overall achievement would take care of itself, provided normal motivation and standard instruction. As statistics show, if a child has average or above average IQ, then with high probability they will finish school with good results, enroll in a university, and subsequently find work with decent pay. So Jensen, in his 123-page study, comes to a controversial and disturbing conclusion, that mental abilities apparently have strong genetic influence, and that no efforts by the state, teachers, or parents to improve the grades of children from poor families will lead to statistically significant results. This was a radical claim. If you did not understand the implications, let me explain it plainly. Jensen announced to all of America, in a highly public and controversial way, that children of wealthy parents get better grades, not because of more comfortable conditions and better nutrition in schools, but because they are genetically more gifted. Moreover, he subtly tells us this: statistically, rich people are rich not just by chance. Not because they were lucky, not because they lived in a favorable environment, but because they have genes responsible for higher intelligence. He says that statistically, children of these rich people study better, not because of their parents' wealth and advantages. Wealth and good grades are largely a consequence of genetics. Boom. From that moment, research on intelligence practically completely ceased for more than a generation. Any research on intelligence in connection with genetics was branded with the term genetic racism. And despite all the hatred toward Arthur Jensen's work and toward him personally, despite decades of opposition, the hypothesis about a strong connection between intelligence and genetics has not been refuted by any new data since then. No new evidence has overturned Jensen's core findings. And this is not my words. This is important to note. This is written by a man who has researched and systematized information related to the biological foundations of human intelligence for more than 40 years. His name is Richard Heyer. He is a psychologist, scientist, and the largest and very influential figure in the world of neurobiology of intelligence. His work is seminal and widely respected. Richard Heyer was the editor-in-chief of the journal Intelligence until early 2025, one of the most respected peer-reviewed scientific journals in the world in the field of intelligence research. Articles published in this journal are rigorously vetted and highly influential in the scientific community. In preparing this examination of intelligence, I have relied heavily on his book titled Neurobiology of Intelligence, first published in 2017 and reissued in 2023, indicating its continued relevance and importance. The book synthesizes decades of research into a comprehensive examination of how intelligence works in the brain. Probably the most important area of Richard Heyer's work is his pioneering work on something amazing called neuroimaging. Neuroimaging refers to techniques like functional MRI that allow us to see the brain in action. This technology will, for example, allow us in the future, through brain scanning, to predict a person's level of general intelligence with remarkable accuracy. It will allow us to see the neural signature of intelligence itself. Heyer's books, as always with obscure academic works, are not available in Russian language. However, I recommend that if you want to feel and understand how complex, mysterious, and maximally counterintuitive the work of the thing in your head is for studying, you should read them. They are challenging, but profoundly important. Let me state once more for clarity. The story of Arthur Jensen and the controversy surrounding his work is very instructive for understanding our modern situation. We are extremely sensitive to questions related to our intelligence. We have psychological investment in this question. And if you know you have a fragile sense of self-worth, then it is better not to watch the rest of this presentation beyond this point. But I encourage you to continue. Many viewers may object, saying that there is nothing special in our brain, and consequently, in our intelligence compared to animals. The human brain simply evolved as a result of natural selection because it more effectively promoted the survival of our ancestors and their environment. And this, my friends, is possibly the biggest lie we learned in school. The brain did indeed appear as a result of evolution. That part is correct. Yes, but the more we learn from paleontology and biology, the clearer it becomes. Intelligence does not look like an obvious result of natural selection. On the contrary, it looks like an anomaly, if not to say an error. It looks like something that should not have evolved. According to scientists' estimates, the average weight of an adult human on the planet is 62 kilograms. If we take any other mammal of such weight, then the average volume of its brain would be a measly 200 cubic centimeters, 7 times less than that of a human. That is a remarkable difference. That is, our brain from a biological perspective is a completely atypical thing, and this is very strange indeed. You see, in the process of evolution, even genetically very different species, finding themselves in the same habitat over millions of years, can begin to acquire very similar characteristics through what is called convergent evolution. This is a powerful principle. For example, even such a complex evolutionary invention as the eye developed independently at least 40 times in completely unrelated species throughout evolutionary history, because vision gives a tremendous evolutionary advantage. Vision is incredibly useful for survival, and as a result, genetically dissimilar organisms, in the process of their separate evolution, independently came to the same solution. That is why eyes exist in humans, in turtles, and in octopuses, although we are not related at all and diverged millions of years ago. Or look at wings in birds and bats, completely different evolutionary pathways leading to the same solution. Or fins in different fish species, scattered throughout evolutionary time. There are thousands of examples of convergent evolution, and that is only what we know about from the fossil record. You can simply open a Wikipedia page with some of these examples and spend several hours reading through them. But where are the examples of a brain comparable to the human brain? Why are there no examples of the development of such intelligence as ours as a result of convergent evolution? If intelligence, like eyes, gives such a wild universal advantage for survival and reproduction, then where are the intelligent cats and dogs, the intelligent fish and birds? Why has no other species independently evolved human-like intelligence? I will tell you more about this puzzle. We have no idea what advantages a large brain could give our ancestors in their original environment. It is easy to declare in the age of Einstein that a developed brain is a useful thing. But in the wild and dangerous environment in which humanity existed for most of its history, when every calorie counts, to devote up to 25% of all energy expended by the body to an organ that does not give an immediate increase in survival, to an organ whose greediness caused humanity to lose its evolutionary advantage in physical strength compared to other animals. But what did this energy-hungry organ give our ancestors in return? Flint knives and sharpened sticks. Seriously? That is all? The brain cost us our strength, our speed, our climbing ability. Not only did we begin to walk upright, but also at the top of this entire construction, on our thin and fragile necks, we have to hold a disproportionately large and heavy skull, which is designed to protect the main treasure. This creates vulnerability to injury. But worse than that, and this is the crucial point, this is normal in conditions of modern civilization. However, for most of human history, one of the main causes of female mortality was childbirth. All because a large head of a human baby passes poorly through the birth canal. The baby's skull is large relative to the mother's pelvis. Children are born prematurely and defenseless compared to other animals. They need many years of care before they become independent. And all this is because of the brain. We believe that the ability to use tools, to learn from experience, and to create complex social structures are of course evolutionary advantages. Yes, only our ancestors with all these supposedly cool advantages remained for almost 2 million years very weak and almost marginal creatures. For most of this incredible amount of time, their existence could only be described as vegetating or barely surviving. Humans lived in constant fear of predators. They rarely managed to kill large game. They existed mainly on plant food, insects, and small animals. Some researchers believe that for most of history, humans were scarcely more than scavengers. Stone tools were used primarily not for hunting, as is commonly said, but for breaking bones gnawed by real predators and extracting the bone marrow. Only in the last 100,000 years, which is a very short period overall in the context of human evolution, only in the last 100,000 years, with the appearance of Homo sapiens with our current level of capability, did we become the top of the food chain. So yes, the evolution of the human brain is a huge mystery. What evolutionary advantage justified such a quantity of disadvantages over millions of years? We do not know the answer. No current theory can fully explain the appearance of what is contained in our skull. What we do know quite well is that the harsh existence of our ancestors, when they underfed and starved, froze in cold climates, and fled from predators, all of this made the intellectual potential of humanity remarkably resilient and robust. For example, research shows that children who survived the severe conditions of World War II, including hunger, stress, and interruptions in education, in a number of cases did not demonstrate persistent losses in intelligence, especially if after the war they received nutritional support and the opportunity to study. This certainly does not mean that stress and deprivation are safe or healthy, but the human brain is much tougher than it might appear. In 1978, a unique and remarkable study was conducted in Poland. The essence of it was as follows. After the war, Poland was under the rule of a communist government. Communist ideology and doctrine assumed that a person is fundamentally a blank slate. That is, with proper education, any person can become either a cleaner, an engineer, or a scientist through proper training. The government pursued an egalitarian policy, in other words, provided citizens with maximum equal access to housing, schools, and medicine. This was a deliberate social experiment. In the study, 14,238 children born in 1963 participated. These children took various tests that determined their cognitive abilities. And what happened? Despite the government's unprecedented policy of creating similar conditions for everyone, the children nevertheless radically differed in their test results. Their intelligence, contrary to identical conditions, was not identical. Instead, it strongly correlated with the education and profession of their parents. What conclusion should we draw? Support programs for the poor are, of course, very useful. They are certainly a good thing. It is good that they exist. But we should not expect this to change the situation in education. Children differ greatly in their level of abilities from the start. And as Robert Plomin says, no one embraces this idea more strongly than teachers in schools. It is just that they cannot speak about it openly without professional consequences. The research of Plomin and others shows that even while schools treat all children with respect, teachers are acutely aware that students have different intellectual capacities. Children come in different shapes and sizes, with the most diverse talents and personal characteristics. It is time to use the lessons of behavioral genetics to create a school system that celebrates and encourages this wonderful diversity. Diversity, not uniformity of approaches and goals, appears to be the key to making education beneficial for children with different abilities. The reality of individual differences should not mean educational success for some children and disappointment with failures for others. Instead, schools should be designed to bring out the best in each child according to their abilities. The general intelligence of a person is an extremely stable thing, not as susceptible to external influences as is commonly believed. And not only to external influences, but also to the effects of time itself. There is a Scottish study spanning an astounding 69 years that clearly demonstrates this remarkable stability. In short, its essence is that people took their first intelligence quotient test at 11 years old and the second test as deep old age at 80 years old. And the correlation between the results was a full 72%. Despite decades passing, despite education and life experience, their relative ranking remained similar. In short, if a child is gifted, then this giftedness will likely manifest throughout his entire life in measurable ways. The implications of intelligence research extend far beyond academic achievement. Intelligence predicts long-term life outcomes, occupational success, income level, physical health, longevity, and legal troubles. The effects persist across the entire lifespan and affect quality of life in countless ways. In 1920, Stanford professor Louis Terman undertook an ambitious and what would become famous study. He decided to select children with the highest IQ scores and then observe how their lives unfolded over decades. From 1920 to 1921, for more than 250,000 children in California schools, he selected 1,470 children with IQ scores ranging from 135 to 196. The average IQ of the group was around 150, and 80 of the children had IQ above 170. These were extraordinary children. The researchers tested and interviewed them every 7 years. The results were published in 5 volumes. And here are the key findings about how these gifted people's lives unfolded. They completely refuted the stereotypes about strange and sickly nerds. On the contrary, they were more physically robust and more mature than their peers, both physically and emotionally. They were happier and better adapted socially, and their achievements were far more outstanding. They produced numerous books, scientific articles, stories, poems, musical compositions, screenplays for television and cinema, and countless patents. Intelligence seemed to help them achieve remarkable things. The study also showed that high IQ does not guarantee success if a person lacks proper motivation, but nevertheless, the pattern was clear. However, this research was over 100 years ago. Is there anything more recent and more conclusive? Yes, there is, and not only more recent, but even more remarkable. This research was begun by American psychologist Julian Stanley in 1971. The selected school children were between 11 and 13 years old. But this time, the research focused not on general intelligence, not on overall IQ points, but on a specific ability, extreme scores on mathematical tests. But remember that if a person is strong in one type of cognitive test, they are likely strong in others as well. So the students from this research of mathematically gifted children largely repeated the fate of children from the earlier study. They were more physically and emotionally mature than their peers, and they built successful and very productive careers. But here is concrete data. The research translated a graph showing real professional achievements of this top 1% of students. On the horizontal axis were their math test scores at age 13. These were extremely high scores, top 1%. On the vertical axis was the percentage of people from the sample. More than 30% of students who scored around 700 points on the math test at age 13 had earned a doctoral degree. More than 20% of them had at least one peer-reviewed publication. More than 10% had income higher than 95% of the population. And the most amusing thing is that these are geniuses to start with, already top 1%. But even among them, inequality continues. For instance, the best from this elite group had 18.2 times greater probability of getting a doctoral degree than people from this same top group, but with the lowest scores. That is, even among exceptional intellects, the smarter ones go much further. These people were identified at age 13 by a single test. Moreover, a test of the most abstract subject imaginable, mathematics. Incidentally, you probably know some graduates of talent search programs. Sergey Brin, co-founder of Google, was one of them. Do you know another? Mark Zuckerberg, founder of Facebook, was also discovered in a talent identification program. And surprisingly, Lady Gaga also scores in the top 1% for intelligence. This demonstrates once again that applications of powerful minds extend far beyond stereotypes. And just when you think you understand the basic principle of how the brain works with its G factor, reality collapses on your head. As you read research about the brain, you realize that basic intuition does not help at all in understanding how the brain actually works. I already spoke about Einstein's brain and its possible differences from other brains. All those differences were interesting in themselves. But perhaps the most astonishing thing about his brain is that from a purely anatomical standpoint, it is not so unusual. In fact, when autopsies are performed, it often turns out that a person with an IQ below 70 may have no special anatomical features that distinguish their brain from brains of people with high IQ. But there are other extremely remarkable examples. Kim Peek, by the end of his life, could literally reproduce the contents of at least 12,000 books. He could read the left page with his left eye and the right page with his right eye simultaneously. It took him less than 10 seconds to read one book spread, and he remembered forever about 98% of what he read. In 1979, he made a calculation in his head and predicted the fall of the American Space Station Skylab in the Australian city of Perth. This was before NASA could calculate the trajectory precisely. Even with modern computers, predicting where such objects will fall is not the simplest task. You might think Kim Peek had very high G factor, yes, but he could not button his own buttons and could not take care of himself. He did not understand metaphors and abstractions. He could not explain the meaning of a simple proverb. He was poor at logic and social skills. For example, he could not understand why you cannot shout in a library. In some cognitive tests, Kim's results indicated extremely high intelligence. In others, they indicated profound intellectual disability. People like Kim Peek are called savants. Savantism is a phenomenon in which a person demonstrates exceptional abilities in one area, combined with general intellectual insufficiency. Savants raise two obvious questions. How do they do it, and why cannot I? We actually do not know the answers to either question. The temptation is to assume that savants G, instead of distributing evenly as in normal people, gets pinched into one narrow area, directing all power there. However, we should refrain from such conclusions until proven experimentally, because the brain works by some very strange and unpredictable logic. But I can say that each time we conducted brain research, we always got results directly opposite to what we expected. One important finding involves brain scans of a person playing Tetris before and after 50 days of practice. Based on brain activity, you might logically assume that since the left brain is not particularly active, that is the scan before training, while the right brain is humming, that is the trained brain. But actually, it is the opposite. After practice, brain activity decreases and remains decreased even at the hardest game levels. Activity decreased, but we also discovered that the amount of gray matter in the brain increased. And what is really interesting is that the areas where gray matter increased did not overlap at all with areas where brain activity decreased. How interesting. Yes, everything is always more complex than it seems. And characteristically, people with the highest IQ scores show the greatest decrease in brain activity after practice. Their brains use less energy, but perform work more efficiently than brains with lower G factor. Probably, this is because the brains of more intelligent people work more in harmony, and filter out unnecessary noise. High G factor is not just a powerful processor, but an optimized expenditure of cognitive resources. The brain with high G literally spends less fuel, glucose, on complex tasks. This is the essence of efficiency in any complex system. Research shows that if we could shift the average intelligence quotient of the entire human population by 10 to 15 points, this could likely lead to sharp reduction in poverty, crime, and inequality. In general, this would benefit everyone, especially those suffering from the difficulties of life with low general intelligence. Is this not a weighty argument in favor of funding support programs that do not stigmatize people as lazy or unworthy? Is this not a reason to prioritize neurobiological research on intelligence and ways to increase it? The implications of understanding intelligence extend to virtually every domain of human life. People with lower general intelligence struggle with reading while simultaneously holding information in working memory. About 1/4 of the global population faces these difficulties. To better understand what it means to have lower intelligence, researcher Richard Heyer compiled statistics that should make us pause and reflect. Consider that only 4% of the population in the United States, just 4%, can use a calculator to figure out the cost of carpet for a floor. The remaining 96% do not even understand how to calculate floor area and multiply it. That is not a joke. It is research from 1992. But okay, that is admittedly not the easiest problem. Moving further down the table, 1/4 of people cannot calculate miles per gallon, which is equivalent to figuring out how many kilometers you can travel on a specific amount of fuel. The real horror emerges when you discover that 14%, 36 million people in the USA at that time, cannot determine the price difference between two show tickets, nor can they find an intersection on a map. I read that section 10 times, thinking maybe there was a translation error, but no, it literally says exactly that. Pay attention to the fact that this data is more than 30 years old, and possibly the percentages have changed slightly, but the main point remains unchanged. Intelligence matters enormously in everyday life. This is not about rocket science or advanced mathematics. This is about basic, practical problem solving. Richard Heyer notes that people with IQ around 70, approximately 7.4% of the population, find even the simplest learning to occur very slowly and require concrete, step-by-step systems with individual instruction. Complex material is extremely difficult or impossible for them. For people with IQ 80 to 90, approximately 16% of the population, learning still requires very clear, structured, individual approaches. But when textbooks enter the picture, typically IQ of at least 100 is required, and to enter university and study successfully, IQ of ideally 115 or higher is necessary. In other words, higher education is accessible primarily to only 16% of the population, primarily for genetic reasons. Of course, people with lower IQ can obtain degrees, but studying becomes vastly harder. Yet let me state clearly, Christopher Langan is a famous counterexample. He scored among the highest ever recorded IQ in the world, predicted at 1 in 10 million frequency. Yet he worked as a forest firefighter, builder, cowboy, forest ranger, farmer, and for over 20 years as a bouncer on Long Island. Completely ordinary, non-lucrative professions. So among people with identical IQ, there exist both millionaires and unemployed people. Life circumstances matter. Motivation matters. Initial opportunities matter. But statistically and generally, the pattern holds. People with very high intelligence find high-paying, complex work easier to obtain. Statistical evidence shows people with IQ below 90 drop out of school 133 times more frequently than people with IQ above 110. For those with IQ below 90, becoming a permanent recipient of government assistance is 10 times more likely. Probability of prison is 7 times higher. Probability of living in poverty is 6.2 times higher. Considering that methods ignoring neurobiology data have not eliminated poverty in 50 years, should we not consider different approaches based on understanding actual cognitive differences? Cognitive segregation, This is the invisible but absolutely real phenomenon nobody discusses. It simply means people with very different intelligence levels rarely interact with each other, not through snobbery or deliberate choice or social rules, but because we unconsciously gravitate toward people similar to ourselves in thinking capacity. We unconsciously arrange our lives so that we interact mostly with such people. Research shows that among married couples, spouses correlate on intelligence 4 times more frequently than they correlate on personality traits or character. If you are married and both of you take IQ tests, you will likely be surprised at how close your scores are. This is not because you met in university. It is as if you have an internal intelligence test determining if someone is acceptable partner material. Because people with very high intelligence and very low intelligence are at population extremes, finding partners becomes exponentially harder. They might have tens, hundreds, or thousands of times fewer potential partners than average intelligence people. Genetic and social assortative mating, selecting partners of similar intelligence, means children of highly intelligent parents are likely to have highly intelligent other parent, making their offspring above average. The same process occurs with less intelligent parents in reverse, but even more profound, people with high intelligence seek those capable of providing intellectual stimulation. Friendships form not randomly. Research indicates friends have similar intelligence levels on average. This begins early. Highly intelligent children prefer older friends matching their intellectual needs. But many also experience something curious. Childhood friendships that felt deeply close gradually become superficial and unsatisfying. The friendship weakens or breaks, not from fighting or moving away, but because intellectual development proceeds at different rates and cognitive trajectories diverge. Someone interesting at 10 becomes less interesting at 20 and completely uninteresting at 30. Genetic researcher Robert Plomin notes that you are not a passive observer of your environment, but an active player shaping it. With age, you increasingly shape the environment around you according to your genetic preferences. If you have high intelligence, you likely sit with similar students in school classes, then attend university with many similar people, then work in organizations where most have completed university, attend events where most are similar, spend leisure time like similar people, repeatedly crossing paths with your kind. Your world becomes increasingly homogeneous. Yet cognitive segregation creates dangerous illusions. Most high intelligence people cannot imagine life with low G factor. They lack the lived experience. They have internalized the false belief that everyone has similar abilities to solve everyday problems. They do not understand how genuinely difficult modern life is for those struggling with complexity. They cannot fathom not understanding basic instructions or struggling with simple calculations. This creates invisible class divisions that are hidden from those privileged enough not to experience them. Yet we must emphasize that discussing statistical tendencies observed in large populations does not imply that individuals are entirely predetermined by their intelligence level. Success comes in many forms and varieties. High intelligence does not automatically guarantee life achievement. Conversely, lower intelligence does not condemn someone to failure. Many people with average or below average IQ live rich, meaningful lives. They may not become scientists or lawyers, but they can be excellent parents, loyal friends, skilled craftspeople, and contributors to their communities. Intelligence is one factor among many. Moreover, understanding intelligence need not be depressing. It can be liberating. Once we accept that people have different cognitive abilities, not better or worse as humans, just different in capacity, we can design systems acknowledging this reality. We can create education matching each child's learning needs, rather than forcing uniform approaches that frustrate both gifted and struggling students. We can support those struggling with cognition, rather than blame them for insufficient effort or willpower. We can build societies that accommodate the full range of human cognitive ability. The brain remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of science. Despite decades of research and billions of dollars spent, we remain humbled by what we discover and astonished at what remains unknown. The mechanisms by which genes influence brain development remain incompletely understood. The plasticity of the brain, its ability to change and rewire itself through experience, continues to reveal surprises that overturn our expectations. And perhaps most profoundly, the origin of our remarkable intellectual abilities and their seemingly excessive evolutionary cost remains a puzzle we have yet to solve. Why intelligence emerged as the dominant feature of human evolution when it appears to provide minimal survival advantage remains one of science's great mysteries.